Now we are getting into the service communication section, and in this section we would be covering the AWS resources and services like step functions, SWF simple workflow, SQS simple queue service, Amazon MQ, that's a message broker, Amazon SNS simple notification service, and somewhat some fan out pattern with the SQS and SNS. So here we will be beginning with the step functions. So step functions. Here for the step function, you don't need to learn them in depth going to the exam, but you need to know the capabilities and where they fit in your solution architecture. So the idea with a step function is that you are going to build serverless visual workflow to help you orchestrate your Lambda function, but not only they represent the flow as a JSON state machine, and it has so many features such as sequence actions, parallel actions, condition timeouts, error handling, and so on. So the maximum execution time of a workflow is 1 year. So that is something you need to know as a solution architect. And you have the possibility to implement human approval features if you wanted to go on with your flow. The idea is that you chain Lambda function with step functions, which is a very common pattern, and you need to be mindful that there is going to be latencies between all the calls to the Lambda function, because you are passing some information from one Lambda function to the another Lambda function. So if we look at the step functions visually, so here's what it looks like. So this is the graph that AWS will generate for your JSON state machine, and as you go through an execution, you will see in real time that the execution is and how it looks like. And so you get success, failed, cancelled, and progressed, and then like when it's done, you can look at the entire flow, and your step function went through and to go to the completion. So the last one is end option, and after that it's been completed. So step function has a lot of integrations. So there are some optimized integrations, for example, with some Lambda functions. So a step function can obviously invoke Lambda functions. They can run AWS batch jobs, they can run ECS tasks, and wait for it to complete. They can also insert an item into the DynamoDB table. They can even publish messages to SNS and SQS. They can launch EMR jobs, Elastic MapReduce jobs, Glue jobs, SageMaker jobs, and so on. So they can launch another step functions workflow also, and then using the AWS SDK integration, you get access to overall 200 AWS services directly from your state machine, and it works like a standard AWS SDK API call. So step functions are very versatile. On top of it, there are ways to trigger step functions, and there are multiple ways. So you can invoke and trigger a step function state machine using Lambda console. Using the AWS SDK, you can use the CLI, you can use AWS data and AWS. Of course, the SDK you can use here, you can use API gateway, so that any call to API gateway does trigger a step function. You can use event bridge, and then integrations are limitless, and like call pipeline, code pipeline. So it's possible for you in your code pipeline to invoke step functions. And finally, all the step functions can also invoke step functions. Now, step functions have so many applications. And you can see a bunch of sample project at this URL in your console. And the idea is that there are so many different applications. I can't even count them all, but I'll give you some. I'll give you some of them. Process high volume messages from SQS. So it is possible to set up an SQS and Lambda function to process a lot of messages from SQS, or for example, train a machine learning model when you have to synchronize between SageMaker, Lambda, and Amazon S3, or manage a batch job if you want to have batch Amazon SNS and so on, or if you want to manage a container task and you want to run Fargate task whenever something happens. And so there's so many different of those, but the idea is that as soon as you need to change stuff and orchestrate stuff in AWS, the best way to do so is usually with the step function. So what can a step function do? Okay, it can do many things, and you have to remember them going to the exam. Number one is do stuff with AWS Lambda. They are called the Lambda task, and they will just invoke a Lambda function. You have activity task, and the activity is something a bit more broad. It is you have to set up an HTTP activity worker, and could be an EC2 instance, a mobile device, or even an on-premise data center, and they will pull the step function service and they will get the activities out of the step function. So this is not serverless, and this is your activity worker who have to pull the step function service and say, is there something for me to do? And then a step function will say, yes, there is, do that. Okay, you have service tasks then, which is more integrated. So when a step function will connect to a supported AWS service, and that can include a Lambda function, an ECS task, a Fargate container, a DynamoDB table, a batch job, an SNS topic, and SQS. So there is a direct integration. There is a direct integration between a step function and all these services as part of your workflow. And finally, a wait task. If you want to wait for a certain duration or until a timestamp, so a very common question at the exam is going to be, does a step function integrate with our AWS Mechanical Turk? Does it integrate? So the answer is no. The best way to do is to use AWS and you will see ASWF, and you will see in the next lecture. So that is one little thing. After you see Mechanical Turk, usually they want you to see like ASWF instead of a step function. So as a solution architecture, where does a step function fit into your entire structure? So when I give you a step function and you need to trigger it, so you can do a simple API call from the AWS SDK or CLI. You could also integrate it with CloudWatch events to have something happen in CloudWatch events and then trigger automatically your step functions workflow. Or you can have very commonly a REST proxy integration through the API gateway. So the API gateway would be integrated with a step function through a service proxy, and you would do a REST API call in the API gateway to invoke and pass data to your step function. That is a very common use case. And once your step function is created, so this is an example where we are interacting with DynamoDB table. So we need to see that the DynamoDB table, in which case maybe we'll invoke a Lambda function to do that. Then we need to go on the loop and read the next message from DynamoDB, in which case we may just use a DynamoDB integration to read the next message, and then we have to send the message to SQS, in which case we can also use the redirect integration with SQS. Obviously all these steps could also be Lambda function, but the more deeply integrated your step function is going to be with AWS services, the faster your execution is going to be and the less cost you are going to incur. So this is a very simple example, but you can see that a step function can get quite complex. They can go through some very good workflows, have integration with AWS services at depth, and to trigger step functions is usually either directly through CloudWatch event or through the API gateway. Okay, and okay, that's it for this lecture, and I hope you liked it, and I will see you in the next one.